Well, good afternoon. My name is Nu Gao, and I'm with the Public Policy Institute of California. So to my left is Jenna Fenario. She is the executive director of Future Forward Ohio and the Ohio Department of Education. So our second panelist is Meredith Strong. She is a school counselor at the B. Everett Jordan Elementary School in North Carolina. She's also the 2023 American School Counselor Association's School Counselor of the Year. So next to Meredith is Karen Van Alstel. She is the Senior Director of Practice and the Collaborative for Academic, Social, and Emotional Learning, or CASEL. Welcome. Sitting next to Karen is Julia Guan. She is a Senior Research Scientist at the University of Chicago Consortium on School Research. And next to Julia is Madeline Colson. She is an Education Equity and Evaluation Consultant at the Puget Sound Educational Service District in Washington State. Excuse me. Welcome. So first, let's start off with a research presentation. So Julia and Madeline.
Great. Hi, everyone. I'm Julia Gwynn, and I'm a researcher at the University of Chicago Consortium on School Research. We are a research practice partnership, and we have been partnering with the Chicago Public Schools for probably about 30 years now, conducting research to support their ongoing efforts around school improvement and improvement in student performance. I am going to talk today about a small study that we did as a follow-up to a larger study that actually, both of which predate the work that we are here doing as part of the Restart Network. So the original brief that I'm going to just talk briefly about today, we looked at student engagement and learning during COVID-19. And our focus was on student course grades as an indicator of student engagement. So the question was, what happened to students' course grades during the pandemic? First, when students first went remote in spring 2020, and then during the following school year, the 21 school year. Our interest in course grades is a long-standing, if you don't know anything about the consortium, we have a long-standing interest in in the grades that students earn in their courses. And at least in pre-pandemic years, grades were thought to be a really strong indicator of engagement. So grades are generally reflective of whether or not students are doing what they're asked to do, whether or not they're coming to class on time, whether or not they're turning in their homework, whether or not they're meeting teacher expectations. And we've done a lot of research on course grades as being highly predictive of later in life outcomes, as have many other organizations. But we weren't really sure whether or not we could look at course grades as an indicator of engagement during remote learning. So of course, most likely teachers had to modify their expectations during remote learning. CPS, the Chicago Public Schools, put in place a modified grading policy during remote learning, at least during that first term, and that policy included not giving out any Fs. They gave out incompletes instead of Fs in the case where students were not actually engaged in a particular class. But we figured it was worth taking a look to see what happened to course grades, and if we found that grades declined during remote learning, we really wanted to understand how widespread was that decline and who was affected, who was earning lower grades. So in that original report, we focused on students who were in 4th grade and higher. And we found very different findings based on students' overall grade level. So among high school students, we found that actually grades improved somewhat. High school students earned more A's during remote and hybrid learning than in pre-pandemic years. So even in that initial spring 2020, when learning first went remote, the proportion of grades that were A's went up by 10 percentage points compared to pre-pandemic years. And even a year later, so at the end of the 21 school year, A's were still relatively higher than in pre-pandemic years by about 8 percentage points. And interestingly, at the other end of the spectrum, we did not see an uptick in Fs or incompletes. We sort of lumped those together, even though students were sort of held harmless for getting an incomplete. It still signaled not being engaged in a class. So high school students did, at least as far as we could discern from their grades, they did okay. They were faring pretty well during remote and hybrid learning. But when we took a look at students in 4th through 8th grade, we saw a slightly different pattern. So still, more than half of all course grades during remote and hybrid learning were A's and B's. But amongst a subset of students, we saw a very large uptick in either incompletes in that first term or F's during the remote and hybrid year. So just to give a little context to that, in pre-pandemic years, very few students in 4th through 8th grade ever earned F's. 2% of all grades were F's. In spring 2020, 14% of all grades were F's, and then even by spring 2021, although things had improved, 7% of grades were still F's. So big uptick in that really difficult term, but still higher than expected even 1 year later. There was a good deal of variability amongst students in terms of who was at risk of earning F's or incompletes. All students, their risk went up, but Black and Latino students were at much higher risk of earning either F's or incompletes. We tend to call those no credit grades. Than students of other races or ethnicities, as were students who qualified for free or reduced price lunch. So our most vulnerable populations of students were at much higher risk of failing classes. Interestingly, once we took into account the schools in which students were enrolled, we saw that the race gap really diminished. So in other words, Black and Latino students were much more likely to be in elementary schools where everybody was earning more F's and incompletes, which was something we were sort of curious about. So that is the context that we wanted to understand a little bit more about. And to do that, I'm actually going to skip over these slides. This just provides more context to our original findings. To understand a little bit more about what was behind student experiences that could have led to those grade findings, we turn to the 5 Essentials survey. This is a survey that CPS and the consortium have been jointly administering for, I don't know, maybe like 25 years. In the district, it's given every spring, and it's given to students in 4th grade and higher, and also to all teachers. The surveys focus on what we call the essential supports for school improvement: effective leaders, collaborative teachers, involved families, supportive environment, and ambitious instruction. But we're going to just focus on the student survey, which really focuses on supportive environment and instruction. And then the student survey also asks a few additional questions, namely around social emotional indicators. So let's see. The survey includes a bunch of different questions targeting particular constructs. This shows how different student responses in 2021 were compared to pre-pandemic years. This is just focused on students in 6th through 8th grade. Students in 4th and 5th grade look very similar, so we sort of summarize these all together. The bars that are on the left side of the main line show that the 21 responses were lower than pre-pandemic years. The bars on the right side show that 21 responses were higher in pre-pandemic years. So the first 4 bars here capture constructs related to instructional quality. So there was quite a decrease in students' responses about instructional quality. They described instructional quality as declining, as being lower in the 21 school year compared to pre-pandemic years, which I think is not surprising. It's remote learning. I should have added that during the 21 year, Chicago was fully remote in the fall and then transitioned into hybrid mode sort of as the year wore on. So there was a lot of time online. The next 4 constructs are really about supportive relationships, either with teachers, peers, another peer measure, or parent support. And students in 4th through 8th grade really report higher levels of student-teacher trust, more supportive relationships with peers, and greater support for peer academic work. Interestingly, parent support in the eyes of students of these sort of middle grades declined. The last 4 measures, these 2 measures capture engagement and learning. So study habits stayed about the same, academic engagement decline, grit decline, emotional health showed a decline. We map on high school students and we see some similarities and some differences. High school students also report declines in instructional quality, but they report even higher increases in supportive relationships. And the other thing that's interesting about high school students is they report increases in study habits, which we thought was quite intriguing. And not a lot of change around academic engagement, grit, or emotional health. Now, someone's going to ask me, well, did you tie these in to whether or not they were associated with grades? And the reason why I said this was a smallish study is we did not do that. But other consortium work has really shown the value of supportive relationships with teachers and peers around grades. And so our conjecture is that high school students actually were able to get through much of the challenges of remote learning because from their perspective, these supportive relationships, connections with other people really improved, and also their study habits improved, this is actually a measure of prioritizing study. So there was a greater prioritization of among high school students. So I think I'm running out of time. We did also look, which I can talk about at a later point, we did look at, there were significant differences by race among students in 4th through 8th grade in terms of their survey responses, but not so much at the high school level. And across the 2 grade bands, we saw a few differences in responses based on free lunch qualifications. So just going to flash up our, not surprisingly, we see based on survey reports that instructional quality seems to have been difficult to maintain. High school students were possibly able to maintain their engagement with strong support, and perhaps the improvement in study habits may have paid off in terms of keeping their grades or actually improving their grades a little bit. The elementary and middle grade students really struggled, even though they too reported higher support. And just to tie back to some of our earlier grade findings, we also found that a lot of the race differences were explained by the schools in which students were attending. So Black and Asian students reported lower levels of instructional quality, relative to white students, particularly for Black students. That was very much related to the schools in which they were attending. So that felt very fast. But hopefully I made it within 10 minutes.
Hi, my name is Maddie Colson. I'm from the Puget Sound Educational Service District out of the greater Seattle area. I'm also a Chehalis tribal member. In our ESD, or Educational Service District, we're part of a network of 9 ESDs within Washington State that provide regional support to school districts and other educational entities in our area. We primarily serve King and Pierce County, which is like Seattle to Tacoma, if you're familiar with Washington. I'm part of the strategy evaluation and learning team. So basically our team gets contracted out to plan and implement evaluation projects on a variety of educational projects throughout the state. So we get to work on like a lot of really fun educational projects. But one that I want to talk about in particular is one of our larger projects, which is the ESSER Attendance and Reengagement Project that's being implemented throughout the state. I'll share a little bit about the evaluation questions and methods that we designed in collaboration with our partners, but I really want to focus on kind of the process of designing the evaluation plan in collaboration. And I'll share some of the results that we got out of that, and then I'll come back a little bit to the co-design process with our state tribal educational compact schools. You'll hear me refer to them as STEC schools or sometimes tribal schools. I'm using them interchangeably. So a little bit of background on the project. The Attendance and Reengagement Project is looking to address the crisis of engagement and disengagement that students and families are experiencing as a result of the COVID pandemic. I'm particularly interested in the support and experiences of students who have been furthest from educational justice. You can see this map here of our districts and our STEC grantees. There's a lot of them, and they are all across the state. So the way implementation has looked has varied based on the needs of their districts, some focusing more on case management services and direct services, while some are focusing more on more systemic supports, but for the vast majority, it's some combination of the two. So we developed all of these evaluation questions in collaboration with our partners, but for the sake of time, I'll just focus on our overarching question that we were hoping to answer through the evaluation of the project, which is to what extent and in what ways did the initiative build capacity and create systems change to support engagement and reduce the persistent inequities that push out students furthest from educational justice. So for the preliminary stages of the evaluation, these are the methods that we use to answer that question with our district grantees. And the preliminary stages we're kind of thinking as summer 2022 through November 2022. So that's what the data that I'll share is from. So some of the methods that we used, we looked at a variety of various planning and monitoring reports that districts and other grantees submitted. We interviewed staff at various levels of implementation, from districts to state and Office of Native Ed, a variety of staff. We gathered data about students and families and their experiences via direct service staff that were providing them services, and we looked at a lot of district summary information. What's not included in our preliminary reports is any of the story of our STEC schools. Because of the time and intentionality that we took to really co-design the evaluation with them, that was still in process when this was released, but I'll touch on more of that later. What I want to focus on for now is the data that we gathered about students and families that was collected through our direct service staff, and partly because we knew that if we really wanted to understand what students and families were experiencing, how they were feeling connected or disconnected to the work, and really what the perceptions and experiences navigating the school system during the pandemic would be, that we really needed to focus on the experts themselves, which of course is the students and families that are navigating those systems. So to ensure that we were really approaching this with a lot of humility, with a really focus on power sharing and how we were really centering the voices of the students and families, there were some processes that we put in place, kind of a lot actually, but there's three that I'll highlight for these purposes. One is that we set up weekly and biweekly meetings with all of our implementation partners at various stages, from the state to district to those doing the work. We have reoccurring meetings to make sure that our evaluation plan and questions are really matching what the implementation of the work is looking like. We wanted to be really responsive to how implementation was changing since the program started, what students and families were experiencing that they shared with direct staff, and what the experiences of the staff were that we needed to be responsive to in our evaluation methods and questions. I'm going to jump down on the bottom. The tool that we're using to gather data from families and students receiving direct services was also designed and piloted in collaboration with those providing direct services. So we wanted to make sure that the questions that we were asking, the indicators, which looks at reasons for student disengagement, positive experiences of students in school, supports that would be helpful for them to re-engage, as well as steps that they took to re-engage, if at all, in school. We made sure that direct service staff were giving input on to what questions we were asking, how the data was going to be gathered, what the tool looked like, and to make sure that both that it was really capturing the story of what students and families were experiencing, that we weren't centering ourselves as the experts of student engagement or disengagement, that it was really coming from what direct service providers and students and families themselves were saying about what they want to share with their story, as well as making sure that the tool was feasible, that we weren't taking away too much from the actual work that was being done and all of the time and effort that goes into relationship building, and that they were really able to focus on doing the work in a good way. So we piloted that in last summer, and we've continued to be responsive to needs as it changes. The last thing is that we've facilitated meeting-making sessions with those that have shared their data with us at every stage of the data collection process. We really shared data back with them, and we asked for feedback on what resonated, what connected, does this match your experience, what's standing out to you, as well as how can we make this data actionable, how can we give it back to you in a way that informs the next year of the work, as well as what additional data would be helpful to really be able to use to inform your work. So those are some of the main processes that we put in place throughout the project and have continued to evolve, just to make sure that we're really centering the experts on the subject and to really center those who are furthest from educational justice and most disengaged in school. And so through this process, there was some data that we got back. We expect this to continue to evolve as relationships with staff evolve. And I won't touch on this too much. The link to the full report is in the slides if anyone's curious about the full report. But some things that we found out for why students were disengaged was that they didn't have the support needed to succeed with their schoolwork, and that was more common for high schoolers and middle schoolers. And we also found that students were experiencing really high rates of physical and mental health issues, which is pretty common across all grade bands. And then on the flip side, positive experiences that students are having in school. They really like being with their friends. I think no surprise there. And that they really like one or more of their classes, which is good. And another key part of this process, like I said, was that if we really wanted to find out and center the voices of students and families that are experiencing disengagement, was that we needed to go into the context of their communities and really find out and hear from them about, what questions we should be asking and how we should be answering them. And this looked really different for our STEC partners as well. There are 29 sovereign tribal nations within Washington state, 6 of whom were grantees of this project. And so we knew going into it that we really needed to honor tribal data sovereignty first and foremost. That was our biggest guiding principle going into this process. And for those who are unfamiliar, data sovereignty is the right of a nation to govern the collection, ownership, and application of data concerning the tribe or its members. It's the right of the tribal government to control the use and reuse of data by third parties. So we couldn't go into this project anyway saying this is the data we want from you, and this is how we want it collected, and this is how we're going to tell your story. We really worked to develop a partnership with our partners at the STEC schools and tribal councils and all of those things to really say, like, what data would best tell the story, what are you comfortable with us having, and even the data that they're required to report to the state. Is it okay if we use it, and how would you like it to be used, and how can we really tell the story in a way that honors your approach and what you're comfortable with. The second reason that we approached this differently is that we knew we needed to address the underrepresentation of Indigenous people in data. We're often categorized as other or told that our sample sizes are too small to be used, which of course erases our story and also doesn't provide us with any actionable data that can inform our work. So if our evaluation question is to tell the story of those who are furthest from educational justice, we knew we really needed to center the stories and the experiences of our Indigenous students. So we wanted to make sure that the data collection was going back and benefiting the tribal schools and tribal students and tribal families, and that it was both actionable and highlighted all of the things, including highlighting cultural capital and cultural resiliency, and that we weren't coming into it with a deficit-based lens that happens so often, of course, as was asked for by our tribal partners. And then finally, we wanted to build and center relationships throughout the process. Even though I'm Native, I still work for a state agency, and so that still creates a different dynamic coming in to it, and our tribal schools don't always have, the best relationship with government. There's a lot of mistrust, and so we spent a lot of time really building relationships with students and families and staff to make sure that it wasn't only informing this project, but it can inform future projects, because at the end of the day, it's for the benefit of the Native students and Native families. So I just wanted to share a little bit about that process and just how important it was for us to really meet the tribes and the STEC schools where they're at in order to really understand the students' experiences and families' experience in the context of their school experience. So thank you.
Now, I'd like to invite all of our panelists for a panel discussion. So the first question to all of you is, what is something you've heard during the presentation that either affirms what you've experienced or what you've seen others experience during the pandemic?
So we have been thinking a lot about chronic absenteeism in Ohio. We have seen that our rates are doubled what they were pre-pandemic. And if you look at our districts, you'll see that pretty much holds true across districts, but that we had some districts that had perhaps 5% prior to the pandemic, and now they're at 10%. We had one district that reached a peak of 75% of their students would be considered chronically absent. And so, listening to the presentations, I was thinking a lot about, that the school, right? School and district matters, but also that the student experience is so different. And in one of our, investments we've made with these funds to address some of these chronic absenteeism issues, we've partnered with Graduation Alliance, who districts could opt in. They could send students they were, concerned about their attendance challenges, and they would be assigned a coach who would work with them. And that's been a rich trove of information for us about some of these challenges that our students are experiencing. And though, chronic absenteeism is a challenge, the reasons are so different. And so we, at the state level, are starting to think more deeply about how we can meet these different types of challenges our students bring, much like I saw up on your slide as well. And so we're right now, in a task force, state of mind where we're planning for the future and really thinking about these different needs that students bring and how we can better address them. So thank you.
Yeah, I am still an elementary school counselor right now, and so it does not surprise me at all that their grades suffered as well. I think that you hear a lot about like high school students suffering, and they're missing graduations and having to miss out on all of these milestone moments, and 100% like that is valid as well. But I think with elementary school kids, the developmentally appropriate teaching was just not there online. And, when you think of a kindergartner's, focus level, right, you're plus or minus 2 or 3 minutes from their age. So are you supposed to, get them back online every 10 minutes, right? It just was not feasible in that. So that doesn't surprise me, even with, 4th and 5th graders, you're looking at 12 to 15 minutes increments there of teaching and learning opportunity before in a school setting, right? We're doing movement activities, we're doing brain breaks, we're, cooperative learning, all those things that go into teaching in grades 4 through 8. That doesn't surprise me at all. But it really does affirm, too, that when you say when you said that the student-teacher trust and the supportive relationships with peers was increased, I kind of fist pumped a little bit, because I think that was our whole drive of, you have to have Maslow's before you can have Bloom's, right? You're not going to learn anything if you don't trust someone. And so while I hate that the grades were where they were, right, the fact that we still brought kids back into our building with loving and trusting relationships and adults, I think is a little bit of a win for me as a school counselor, because I know in my building I really had a push for continuing those morning meetings, continuing the culture building, even in a digital platform. And so to have that kind of validated a bit was really exciting, and shows that we still know those relationships are still important. The learning hopefully will come.
I'll echo some of that. I think it was interesting. We work with districts across the country who are building SEL departments or building an SEL strategy, and I think I heard from a lot of our SEL leaders that, finally I'm being called to the table, the big kids table, to talk about these things, right? So, I'm not surprised to see the relationship piece being emphasized, the supportive environment piece being emphasized. And so now what do we do to sustain that over time? And the power of the peer piece in both of your sets of data, I think, was so important. And are we being intentional about what the teacher moves are to capitalize on that key desire to be with peers and to learn from and with peers, to do cooperative learning, to do project-based learning? Or is that more of something that's happening on the side, or peers are doing young people are doing on their own, but we are not being intentional as educators to build that into our structures?
So in your work, are you seeing any differences in school connection across students of different background?
So I think, again, it depends on what you're measuring to look at for student connection, but certainly if we use absenteeism, as I mentioned, often to think about, if students are connected, and we do certainly see that, again, based on student backgrounds, their grade bands, demographics. Yes, same storm, not the same boat, and people have been very differently impacted. So I mentioned, our chronic absenteeism, across the state, the average is 30%, but for our Black students, it's nearly 50% now. So we do know that, again, students had very different experiences, different supports, and that we need to be mindful of that as we're programming and trying to support our kids across the state.
Yeah, I'm in a Title I, rural community setting. And so we very much are still a community school, but I am within a larger district where more suburban and urban schools are there. And I think that the differences that I see with my kids is ones that have always been there, that school is not always a priority because we have lots of shift workers and farm workers, and that that was still essential pieces even during the pandemic. And so school, continues to kind of fall by the wayside. So are we helping out our families? Are we helping out to watch our siblings? Those types of things that we're having to, same storm, not the same boat, comes into play. And I think that still asking individuals about their experience, regardless of background, is still really important, because everyone is kind of coming into this collective trauma situation in a way that we don't always know the reasons. And so I think asking those questions, really, like, what answers do we need to find out, right, is a great start, because we can't just assume that we know the right questions to ask or how they're feeling because of a certain background.
Yeah, I would say, a number of our districts aren't trying to measure school connectedness directly, and I think it doesn't look the same in every district, but I think we're hearing from them that is lower for non-white students, that it is lower for LGBT students, lower for high school students is what we're hearing.
So in your experience, what are some of the strategies that have been successful to help those students?
I mentioned earlier Graduation Alliance work, and I know I just gave a quick synopsis of that, but we're at the early point with our research, so I can't plant a flag yet and say that this is the solution, but the early indicators are very promising. That one, our students are engaging a lot with these coaches, we are seeing their attendance increasing, and that they're very satisfied with getting this extra layer of support, which again, these coaches help figure out what that challenge might be, whether it's that they're providing childcare for a younger sibling, or that they've fallen behind, they don't feel like they belong to school, and connecting them to appropriate resources. So again, I think that we're optimistic, looking still for the full report. I think the challenge with a lot of this ESSER-funded work is that we were, building the plane as we fly it, which I think we probably all say many times a day if you live in the land of ESSER funds. But that, so the evaluation came a little bit behind the programming, so we are still getting more information on impact, but I'm excited about what we see to date, and really optimistic about what our task force will be able to do to prepare us for the future.
Yeah, I think the strategy of building culture and relationships can never be kind of understated. I will say that giving students a voice is super powerful, mainly because the days of adults having all the answers are done. As I grew up as a kid, I think I was 25, 26 before I was like, wow, adults are just winging it, right? They have no idea what's happening. And we have 6-year-olds who know that at this point, because they just watched adults argue for 2 years about what we should do, right? Mm-hmm. And so building that trust back, giving them a voice, because they know you don't have all the answers at this point. So you should just lay your cards on the table, right? And giving them that voice of what would motivate you to come to school? What would motivate you to get this math homework done? Giving them that voice and getting that buy-in, I think has been really effective for me at my school with my students. And kind of building systems around that, where it's not just me doing that, but teachers doing that, our school leadership doing that, making sure that we are taking into account that our cards are shown, mm-hmm. we're done at this point, and that kids are so smart and so resilient, and that if you let them lead and let them kind of have an opinion, they will do so. They will take up that task. And so those strategies have been really powerful for me in my work, and I've seen lots of growth even just this year alone in some of our engagement, some of our grade levels, goals being met, and that type of thing.
Yeah, I love that. We talk a lot about systemic SEL. So SEL is not just that 20 minutes once a week, right? So how do we build this into an overall structure so that the adults are being attended to? We have a real strategy around SEL, that we're looking at data. I think we've had some districts doing some really neat work with looking at data with students, so that the students are sharing, yes, here's what you found about connectedness, and here's why, and here's what we can do about it together. We have districts that are building in structures like the morning meetings, advisories, so that we know that every student is really known, seen, valued in their day-to-day experience.
So I'm hearing from all of you that there's a need to collaborate. And so speaking of collaboration, who needs to be at the table?
Everyone. Is that too easy? I do think that the voice of students and parents at the state level, sometimes it can be challenging to hear those voices, but we need to hear more of them, right? And so, making sure that we're able to get out into the community, hear those voices from many different folks across the state is important for us. Obviously, we also have a large number of districts in Ohio, many that are rural, we have urban, suburban, we've got the whole spectrum, of course, and they have different challenges, as we were saying earlier. So that, again, as we're thinking at the state level about how we do this work, making sure that we have all different populations, demographics, types of districts represented is going to be critical for us so we can make sure that we're not trying to use a one-size-fits-all type of solution.
Yeah, I would definitely echo the everyone sentiment, but also people that you disagree with, people that have different perspectives from you, and whether that looks like state leaders, whether that looks like community, people who hold the purse strings in the community, right? Mental health advocates in the community. I think that one thing that we are really struggling with right now is in our school setting, we have all of these protocols and procedures to, get students mental health care or get students more engaged or more connected in the community, but then the community doesn't have the mental health professionals to serve all of those students that we're sending them, right? So we need their input on how do we make that happen, whether that is through local education universities, right, who have those prep programs. Can we partner with them in some way? So I would say getting creative at who is at the table based off of what strategies and supports you need, parents, community stakeholders, educational institutions that have the programs that are going to feed into that school system is really important, because you have to kind of look down, upstream a little bit of why is this gap happening, and how can we fill that, and who do we need at the table to help kind of put that into perspective for us.
I think they've named most of these stakeholders. I'm thinking about some of the most interesting conversations I've been part of in districts are when you're coming to the table with the same data, but adults are saying, we feel like we have strong relationships with students across the board, and students, one of our districts, 23% of students are saying, I feel like someone would miss me if I was absent from school for a day. And so what is that disconnect, and how do we make sense of that together? I think it's been a really powerful discussion.
So related to that, are there any considerations or perspectives that are being overlooked that needs to be integrated into the discussion?
I think, again, I think we recognize that actually there were. I think part of the ESSER funded work things that we rushed into action, and so we all did the best with what we knew and thought the challenges were, but there was room for more conversation. So I think, again, we're rectifying that now, and that these voices we named are important. People have the table and have those viewpoints, but this work has to be ongoing. And we have to start planning for the future beyond ESSER funds and what that looks like, and setting up a framework where we can continue to bring people to the table around student connectedness and making sure that there are those whole child supports out there. So I'll turn over to my.
Yeah, I think that what's being overlooked is that this is not just a quick fix, right? We didn't lose their trust in 8 months, and we're not going to gain it back then. And relationships are it's not a surface level thing. And so I think making sure that we're investing not just the money or the personnel, but the time is something that I'm really kind of advocating for at my district. Is just because a program didn't work to your exact amount in 8 months, where is the growth that we saw? What is the growth that we learned? And how can we continue to invest with this program or with these supports over time? Because again, kids are super smart, and just giving them ice cream is not going to build that relationship back, right? You have to invest the time and have the adults that are willing to do that, which means that you have to make that pay reasonable, right, for that adult to have their own self-care going on at the same time. So I think that it's super holistic, and we're overlooking the time that it is going to take to maybe recover from this pandemic. And because again, I think someone was saying earlier, this a lot of these were struggles before the pandemic started. It just got exacerbated. So investing that time to kind of fix that is important.
I think this piece about shoring up our adults, I think I'm hearing from all of our educators that adults need a lot more nourishing and care at this moment, and figuring out how to not divorce this conversation about academic recovery and relationship building. Those are not two separate strands. They must be interwoven with one another, and adults themselves need to experience that, and then to be able to translate to their classrooms.
Great. So I have one more question, and then we're going to open it up to audience Q&A. So in Julia's presentation, she talked about pandemic proofing. So in your concluding remarks, can you share us a couple of things? How do we get there?
pandemic proofing is a challenge. I would say that actually you just created a nice bridge, because what we certainly have been thinking a lot about is that, we have three main strategies guiding our recovery work, and it is addressing obstacles to learning, right? Those foundational barriers that if we can't address things like, transportation, attendance, all those sorts of pieces, then our students aren't even in the place to begin to learn. And mental health actually should have been on the top of that list probably for those key obstacles. And then, of course, we're focused on accelerating learning and more effective opportunities to learn, so we can make the most of the time that we do have with students. And the third piece for us is really, connecting students to their future success and helping them think about where they want to go and the why for education, particularly our older students. We've also seen that play out in terms of attendance, that they are really questioning the why. They've seen behind the curtain a little bit. They didn't have to show up every day for a while. And so, we still have more work to do to help them make that connection between school and where they want to go to. But that all three of those strategies have to work together. And that's really key. We can't fix learning without addressing these other pieces. And so I think that's, been a really big learning for us. And the silver lining, if there was anything, this pandemic has been really kind of, I think, across the board. When you talk with district leaders and school leaders, they're saying the same thing, just more thought about how we, treat the whole student.
Yeah, I think as a school counselor, again, pre-pandemic even, we were kind of beating down the door of like, nope, like this isn't working for everyone, right? And the system was disrupted for us. And so how are we going to build it back better, I think has been on the forefront of our minds, because, we all hope that there's not a next time, but I think that looking at, well, what did we learn from this is super powerful, because from, mainstream sources, it might just be all doom and gloom, but like high school kids were still like, there were more A's happening, right? So why was that? What happened there? Why did some students really excel with this? Is there a way that they learn? Why did some students really flounder, right? What do we need to do to support them from floundering next time? And understanding that kids don't learn the same. And so how can we set up differences within our school system to where it's not a one-size-fits-all model, that we are serving all the students regardless of how they learn or where they learn or what they learn, right? And what they need to learn, really breaking into that pedagogy and how we can best teach it. And having that flexibility, I think, is really important to play to students' strengths. Because we were playing to adult strengths and to system strengths before, and it's time to play to student strengths.
Love that. Yeah, I think to me a lot of this speaks to sort of a mindset shift about what does it mean to have a successful school? What does it mean to have a successful student? And opening up our aperture about how we define those things, I think I don't know if pandemic proof is possible, but I think that will help set this conditions for us to get there.
Great. Thank you for all our panelists and also our research presenters. So now I'm going to open this up for questions.
I'm Paulo Di Maria with the National Association of State Boards of Education. I guess I want to ask, Julia, maybe I want to start with you. I have such great respect for the University of Chicago Consortium. You guys do excellent work. And as I listen to what we've talked about here today, my head keeps going to the issue of change management, right? If we want to do different things, we need adults to change their behaviors. And yet I think time and time again, we struggle with exactly how to pull that off. We might have the great research that says, here's the different things that might work, but we struggle then to actually put it in place. Chicago is a beautiful experimental space because you've got hundreds of schools. I'm sure you know the rock stars and the ones that are not quite getting it. Can you talk a little bit about what does good change management and implementation focus really look like, and how do we catalyze more of it?
Wow, that's a great question. I think the thing that comes to mind would be something that predates the pandemic. So in the early or mid 2000s, the consortium, as well as others, did a lot of research on the importance of the ninth grade year, and highlighted the fact that students who failed more classes in ninth grade were at much higher risk of not graduating in 4 years. And CPS really ran with that research, but they did it and I'm probably not the best storyteller here, but high schools, and actually other people in the room could probably supplement to a much greater extent than I can, but high schools started having on-track labs. They started really, and they were their strategies differed, but it was really located at the high school. And part of that is supported by the sort of decentralized structure in Chicago. So there's a lot of decision-making that resides in high schools. And so high schools had the freedom to come up with different ways to really tackle absenteeism was a big issue that was driving course failures. But that was really a pivotal moment. So many high schools got it together and started really focusing on the 9th grade year and getting kids to come to school and understanding why they weren't turning in their homework. So I guess that would be my answer schools are in many times well positioned or in the best position to really think about driving change. That's not always true. I think that there are a lot of partners that need to support change at all levels of the system. But at least in Chicago, I think we've seen a lot of success at the school level.
So create conditions to empower schools to
Yeah.
co-design.
Yeah, and they are the closest to students and to the issues that students have or the struggles that students have around being in school and doing their best work. So that would be my response.
I think I saw a hand here. Yeah. Any other questions for the panelists? Hold on for the mic.
Oh, that's right. Can you hear me? Great. Keisha Osei-Surfo, I'm with the Council of Great City Schools. Had a question about the Chicago study with the grades. I was wondering, the sample was Chicago students, I'm assuming,
Yes.
only. Oh, Chicago
Yes.
only. I was just wondering if there was any recovery period for students where they got an initial, maybe an incomplete, but had an opportunity to change or increase their grades, and whether that was considered in the study.
So that is a great question to which I don't know the answer. I'm looking at it strictly from a data set perspective, and I can't see that. But we did see, again, we saw a lot of variation across schools, and I expect that schools did have different policies around how they handled student performance. So I think it would be not surprising if some schools just were like, we're not going to fail kids. Especially at the high school level, because high schools understand so fundamentally how problematic an F, or in this case, an incomplete is. That message had really been made clear to them from all of this on-track work that I just referenced. I think elementary schools didn't have that same focus, and so might not have had exactly the same awareness about what it means to give an F or an incomplete. And that was where we really saw these big spikes. So I don't know, but I wouldn't be surprised if there were opportunities to improve your grade.
And I just, if I can, have another comment and reaction more so around the work that you're doing in Seattle. And I just really appreciated the tribal data sovereignty, the protection of the indigenous voice. And I just wish that was applied to other underserved populations, because we tend to treat them just as if they were, I should say regular, I'm not sure how to phrase it, but I think that everyone's voices should be protected in that same way, and there should be other kind of guidelines around the voices of other students and families in our districts.
Thank you. Thank you. This is also a question for Madeline. I had to look up some of the terms that you used. I had never heard them before. I'm particularly fond of the term educational justice. But I was wondering if you could talk more about the conversations that you had with the tribes around their data sovereignty and how that went. And it could be a model for not just indigenous populations, but all underserved groups. So I'm really interested to hear how that went and how you approached it and what those conversations were like.
Yeah, absolutely. I want to not get too close, I guess, to talking too much about what worked and what didn't work in the process, because we were hoping to get a lot of feedback from the schools themselves before we made any recommendations or anything like that. But our process was that we set up monthly meetings with each of the schools over a course of, I mean, it's ongoing, but I think before we even got started collecting data, it was probably 6 to 9 months of ongoing meetings with schools, and we met with, well, first the leads on the project, and then often they directed us to tribal council, what they were okay with. The schools have boards themselves, which are often parents, and so there was a lot of people that we had to get feedback from and a lot of permissions, and it took a lot of time, and it was a lot of coordinating, and it was a lot of work, but it's what we had to do. Yeah, that is your question. Yeah.
Could you define educational justice, just for those of us who are, somewhat of a new term?
Yeah, the question actually started out a little bit longer, I'll say, where we listed pretty much each group that had been historically been marginalized from school systems, and kind of just are using it now to coin students, especially within Washington State, that have, I don't know if underperforming is the word that I want to use, but that haven't been like adequately served, or their needs haven't been met by public school systems, including BIPOC students, LGBTQ plus students. Yeah. Yeah.
Thank you. Greg Waples with NASSP. Question for Meredith. Wondering about the current state of professional development for teachers around mental health as we start to, transition pandemic recovery into mental health recovery, and how can these supports be applied in the long term? Just wondering what teachers are currently receiving in terms of identifying mental health issues in the classroom, and also trying to provide care, because I think there's more of a focus on that now as opposed to just referring everything to the counselor or the school psychologist. And of course, there are instances when the mental health professional, if there is one, is able to provide that care. But just wondering if you could comment on the current state of what teachers are receiving in terms of their ability to address some of these issues.
Yeah, I think that there was quite a push for that professional development as we were coming back, because teachers felt overwhelmed with that. And so it was like a lot at first, and then not so much follow-up support in that professional development. And I think that mental health is sort of like an onion. You kind of peel back the layers a little bit, right? But you always find a little bit more out. And so I think we are trying to juggle, or at least I know I am trying to juggle, the voice of like, teachers are not responsible for a student's mental health, like, and caring for that, because that is overwhelming when they are also trying to do their job. And understanding students' mental health is going to make doing your job incredibly easier. And so you got to hold that balance there a little bit. I also think that knowledge is power. And so I think there's a lot of professional development of like terminology and things that have come out. What I would hope is coming, and I have tried to kind of make a push for, is strategies, right? And so we can talk about mental health all day long, but unless you know what to do, you kind of walk away from that conference or that professional development like a little more knowledgeable, but you're just kind of sitting there still, right? So having like adequate strategies of like, if a student is having a crisis, like what are steps 1, 2, and 3 that have to be done, right? So first, validate. Second, like, check for safety, make sure that the safety is there. And then third, how can I like get resources in to help that student? What is our protocols and policies for that? So it's not just professional development for the teachers, but also for the systems, right? The school and the districts in place of how do we bring help in so that it's not all on this teacher to handle. And so again, just trying to balance that has been really interesting. I think that we went a little too far at first of like, all of these kids are feeling anxious. All of them could have an anxiety disorder. What do you do? Well, in regards to kids being anxious, of course they are. They're coming back to school after over a year of not seeing each other, right? Like face to face. And we've heard about germs all day long. So that is a normal response. What can we do as a normal core tier 1 response to to anxiety, right? To something that our body is going to feel, versus telling them or helping them to kind of gather data to see when it actually could be a problematic anxiety disorder, right? So helping teach the difference between them while also not overemphasizing their role in a mental health, because they're not trained to do that. They're not trained to provide mental health first aid, which I think was kind of the trajectory that it was going, was training teachers to provide mental health first aid and really step in a crisis. And like, we have people for that who are trained for that. We don't also need to put that on the backs of teachers. So I think we're getting there. We may have gone a little too far first, but hopefully we are kind of finding that balance a little bit better, and helping teachers to also see that their own mental health is imperative in helping kids with their mental health. So being able to take that breath and figure out, okay, what is my role to serve this kid here? And if not, what are my options?
Oh, such good discussion and so many questions, but I'm going to focus on something that's been simmering just a bit to piggyback off of a few questions. Jana, you mentioned the challenge of, at the state and federal, these broader levels, getting to the voices of those, what Madeline called the experts, right? Those ground level experts who are in the classroom, students and families and teachers. And sometimes even at the local level, when we look at those existing communication structures, sometimes we can find that certain voices are louder than others, and it's really easy to generalize those voices as representative of the whole group or multiple groups. And so my question is, how do we prioritize ensuring a balance between the range of loud and quiet voices? And in addition to establishing that balance, how do we establish structures that will allow us to engage in continual two-way dialogue as opposed to a conversation here, go back, reestablish that balance and that conversation?
That's a wonderful question, and I certainly don't have all the answers, so I hope other folks will weigh in on here that have other thoughts around it, because it's one of the things we're thinking through right now, especially as we do plan for sustainability of a lot of the work that we have underway, that we need everyone to be part of those conversations. I think one thing we found, because one of our efforts has been to gather some of the great things happening across the state, because we know that there's a lot of, like you said, the experts there doing wonderful things that we want to know about. And at first, we were letting people kind of nominate themselves. I've got something great to tell you, and you hear certain voices repeatedly, and they're doing great things. But we had to actually just do more research ourselves, right, and go out and ask other people who work in communities who's doing great work. What do you know about? Working through the connections we know to go find those people rather than waiting for them to come to us, right? And we do have a superintendent advisory group. And again, the people who come to that group, they're not in the field, right? So we have to go to them and say, who should we talk to that's in your community that could give us perspective on this work? The student voice in particular is something we're thinking a lot about right now, because that spoke to me earlier about the disconnect between what adults are thinking the issues are and what students will tell us. And we realized, like, many of our student groups that we have are kind of the A+ students who raise their hands to be in all these groups. And so we've really been thinking a lot about how are we want to hear all students, right? Not just the students who are first to raise their hand to be on some sort of committee. So we have been, again, working grassroots to just kind of ask people. We've been working more with we've got different people in different programs, of course, situated across schools. So it just means we have to be more intentional about going out and looking for those voices and not waiting for the voices to come to us. But in terms of the long-term structure, I mean, that's a fantastic question. And again, all of the groups that we tend to have at the state level are people who are not in the field doing the work per se. And so again, we need to be thinking about that. So thank you for asking that.
Sorry if you can't see me. I just had a great insight. I truly appreciate it. I'm Dr. Brittany Hazard. I'm Milford School District in Delaware. And so thank you so much and congratulations, School Counselor of the Year. So one of the things that you all mentioned, I think, Karen, you talked about a supportive environment earlier. And about sustaining, having sustainability within SEL. And then Meredith, you mentioned the mental health component and being mindful, like in the building, on the ground, that there's a difference between the need for that, but also mental health practitioners are the practitioners. So I am a mental health professional as well. And so coming into K-12 administration over the past few years, it's been enlightening to me to see the difference of understanding of the need or the priority of mental health and kind of meshing mental health and education together. For some, you see the celebration, and for others, it's some hesitancy there. Wanted to get some insight from whomever would like to share around any strategies around supporting districts, schools, organizations around that encouragement. Because we have, we hear about the funding, we talk about some of the strategy, but that implementation isn't happening as smoothly as we would hope it to, and most certainly not as our students need it.
Yeah, I'll jump in really quick. I like to, when I'm working with district people, I think I try to kind of act like a translator a little bit, because if you can't explain it to a kindergartner, you probably don't understand it enough yourself, right? So I like to say, explain it to me like I'm 5, right? And so I think a strategy that has been really helpful in my district is putting it in a layman's terms where maybe they understand a little bit better. So when we're talking about those professional developments or something, if a kid gets a scrape, right? You're not just gonna like bring them up to me as the counselor or the nurse, right? Like with blood dripping down their hand, like you're gonna put a compression on it, right? You're okay, provide that support, that immediate kind of frontline support. And then you're going to find a professional that can help them more. If it's a broken arm, it's not going to the school nurse, it's going to a doctor, a community agency, right? If it's a moment of anxiety, it might be coming to me. We're just some breathing exercises, some coping skills, something like that. If it turns out that it's much more, we're going to a community or organization, that type of thing. So I think mimicking it with physical health, which people understand a little bit better, mental health and physical health, kind of what the parallels of that are, I think is very important. The understanding also of, I think that for a little bit, mental health was optional, maybe. And we still, we weren't seeing the grades or anything like that. I think we do have a better understanding that, that is a foundation. A child feeling loved and safe is when the learning activates in their brain. So bringing in that, neurology piece of it and understanding the brain science behind it is really important. I think that educators often just want to understand the why, and the why kind of gets them excited. The pedagogy, them understanding why a child can't decode and understanding how to help a child decode is a lot, makes them excited about that child learning how to decode. An educator understanding why a child is having, a stress reaction to something in their brain, and the brain science between how we calm that down, right? Makes them a little more excited. It makes it a little less scary of how we can put policies and procedures in place to help that child feel loved and safe in an environment enough to activate the learning part of their brain. And so I think, putting it in simpler terms is key to kind of engage that excitement.
Yeah, and I think from a teacher point of view, if you're thinking about how do I build skills that are going to serve my students well in a variety of domains, how do I build a supportive environment, and how do I build relationships, that's, where my role sits in this puzzle. And those skills that we're talking about in terms of social awareness, self-awareness, relationship building, identity, agency, are going to serve us well, both for our social emotional wellness and for persisting through college and having a successful career and having a successful relationships long term. And I think when people start to see that this is all part of one puzzle, it helps them to put this into their mission and vision.
The other thing at the district that I really advocated for was building it into the master schedule. So I think someone was saying no one who's not at a school can really understand all the pressures that schools are under. The logistics piece of schools are what cause most things to break down, I would say. And so for me, I advocated for the first 25 minutes of the day to be morning meeting for us. That doesn't mean that we only do SEL during that morning meeting. That starts our day off, right? That starts our SEL learning and our journey for the rest of the day. But our teachers no longer feel like, oh, I'm missing writing to do a circle time, right? Like they have that moment, and then it continues the journey throughout the day. But I think districts putting that into the schedule to take a little bit off the teacher's plate of what am I not teaching if I'm teaching this, it can go hand in hand. It can go together. We just have to build that time in.
So we've reached the end of the session, so please join me and thank our presenters and also panelists for a very thoughtful discussion.